right, hi everybody, and welcome to this new and special edition of UMKC Political Science Quick Bites, your quick taster on a political topic of importance in the day. Today, we are celebrating 100 years of the 19th Amendment, which allowed women in the United States to vote at the federal level for the first time. And today, I'm very excited to be joined by my colleagues in the Political Science Department, Dr. Beth Vonnahme, Dr. Mona Lyne, and Dr. Rebecca Best, who are going to tell us a little bit today about the experience of women in politics here in the United States and abroad. So thank you all very much for joining us. My first question is for Dr. Vonnahme. So it's been 100 years since the 19th Amendment was passed today, but it's actually been 103 years since the first woman was elected to Congress, Jeannette Rankin. Can you tell us a little bit about the experience of women in Congress or women running for office today here in the United States?
Sure. So there's quite a few women in the U.S. House and in the U.S. Senate today compared to in the past. So we've got about a quarter of the Senate is female and a same percentage or so in the House of Representatives. But what's really interesting in the U.S. is if you get down to the state level, things are really, there's a lot of disparity across the states in terms of how many women are represented in the legislature and their role within statewide offices. So for example, the Nevada House is the only house that is majority women. So 54% of the Nevada House is women, or House Assembly. Every other legislature in the US is majority male. And then when we look at statewide offices, we see a lot of differences across the states again, but we have 9 governors right now, 9 female governors, including the state of Kansas. But we don't have very many statewide officers, about 90, which is not a large percentage compared to how many there actually are across the country. But we have 1 in Missouri, Nicole Galloway, the state auditor, is female, and then there's 2 in obviously Kelly, but the insurance commissioner in Kansas is also female. But it's changed dramatically over time. We have a lot more representation of women, but we're still not seeing a majority of women in the legislature. And when we break those numbers down a little bit more, there's even fewer women of color in the legislatures across the country. And it varies by legislative session, but between 1 and 5 is usually where we are in most of the legislatures in terms of women of color. In terms of campaigning, it's changed dramatically because campaigning has changed dramatically, right? The emergence of the internet, the emergence of social media has dramatically altered how campaigns are run in this country. In some ways, it's opened up opportunities for candidates that wouldn't have been successful in the past, candidates that don't have significant name recognition. And so that certainly applies to a lot of women in the US. And so that's certainly been a positive. But what it also does is the expansion of TV, internet, and the social media has opened up the opportunity for more attention paid to things like physical appearance. And so that's been a lot of research on that and indicating it doesn't usually, it usually hurts women when voters tend to focus on physical appearance. So that's sort of the campaigning aspect of it versus the legislative aspect.
So it sounds like while there's been a general pattern of improvement, we're still seeing a lot of areas where women have not achieved what we might expect as representational equality.
Absolutely, but I think it's important to keep in mind that a good percentage of the female population even didn't actually have the right to vote in 1919, right? So, I mean, or 1920. So that's an important component of the equation as well. Not till really the Civil Rights Act do we get sort of the full female representation in terms of voting in the US.
And speaking of women's political participation, if we take a more global view, right, from all the way back in, I believe it was 1903 when Finland first allowed women to vote, we see a lot of really unexpected trends globally, with what is always surprising, Rwanda leading the world with 61% of their legislature being female, but a number of other developing democracies also seeing higher levels of women in politics, with Mexico, for example, having about 48% of its legislature being female. So Dr. Lyne, Can you tell us a bit about the patterns of participation of women we see across the globe?
Sure. I'm actually going to talk a bit about women in executive positions.
Great.
You've mentioned that, some interesting trends in terms of legislative positions. But interestingly, women in executive positions have preceded women in executive positions in more developed advanced democracies. So if we think of Indira Gandhi in India, who was prime minister in the 60s and the 70s, Benazir Bhutto in Pakistan was prime minister in the 80s and 90s, and another example, Corazon Aquino, president of the Philippines in the 80s and 90s. And it's kind of an interesting trend because with the exception of Thatcher in the UK and Mary Robinson in Ireland, who were both elected as prime ministers in the 90s, we don't see many female chief executives in the advanced democracies until the turn of the 21st century. And this is kind of a puzzle because, of course, women's rights are certainly more advanced in the more advanced democracies. And so we have this strange pattern, however, where women have seemed to achieve executive positions more quickly. And I think we can kind of make sense of this by thinking about the differences in how women achieve or how anyone actually achieves executive positions in these two types of countries. So in the advanced democracies, women typically, or anyone, I keep saying women, anyone has to develop kind of a reputation for supporting certain policy positions, typically has to develop a career within a political party, and this takes time. In less developed countries, and not all here, but for many of them, it's more, the competition for political office or executive office is more, or revolves more around kind of maintaining the power and position of either a long-standing family dynasty or a long-standing political party. And in these cases, it's more about being a member of this elite group than about developing a long career with a certain kind of reputation. And so if we look at these early examples, in fact, every single one of them were members of an elite family. So Indira Gandhi was the son of, now his name is escaping me, the first prime minister of India. Corazon Aquino was the wife of the previous president of the Philippines, and so on. And now all of these patterns, of course, are changing. But traditionally, I think that helps us understand why, at least partially helps us understand why women have advanced more quickly in unexpected places.
Right, and I think your point about the executives is really well taken. While the international average for women in parliament is about 25%, about where the US is, only 6.2% of heads of government are female. And I'm really glad you brought up Indira Gandhi because she was, of course, the first executive to have a child in office. And it was only within the last 2 years that Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand did the same thing. So I think you've really pointed out something important, that there's this gap, and the selection mechanisms of developing democracies or non-democracies create different kinds of barriers or access than we see in democracies. So I think that's a really important point.
It's good to point out that there have been 0 executives in the U.S. though.
That's
yeah.
Well, we've got our 9 governors. So
that's right. I should say there have been 0 presidents.
There's been 0 presidents, and in fact, right, one of the things that we can point out is that one of the big changes we've seen in the last few years is we have had more female either candidates for president or vice president than we've had for almost our entire history.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
So yes, there's definitely a change, but it's, as Dr. Lyne points out, very slow to change. And speaking of executives and citizens, one of the big areas of growth we've seen since the 19th century has been the change of women in the armed forces. Armed forces playing a critical role in accessing the rights of citizenship. So we've seen a real change in the level of integration of women in the armed forces, especially post 1973 with the end of the draft. So Dr. Best, would you mind telling us a little bit about the role of women in conflict in the armed forces, and also women veterans and how they've played a role in society today?
Sure. So women have, popular belief to the side, women have served in every war in the history of the United States, going back to the Revolutionary War. Women do, and I don't mean to say that women have served in large numbers, right? But if we look at some of those earlier wars, we find women who disguise themselves as men in order to serve. For example, Deborah Sampson served for 17 months in Washington's army under the name Robert Shurtleff. And it wasn't until she was injured that, in treating those injuries, they realized, oh, that's the unexpected anatomy. And we see this again and again, and we don't know really how many women served because they were serving as men. They could, in fact, be imprisoned if they were discovered to be women. But we know of women serving, for example, in the Mexican War. We see the war with Mexico. Elizabeth Newcomb served in the Missouri Volunteer Infantry under the name Bill Newcomb from 1846 to 1848. So we do see women going back through the history of the country serving in the military. And we also see women pushing for more rights in government and greater say in government. We don't really see that take off, though, until World War I, where women are able to leverage their service in World War I to further the cause of suffrage. And so if we look at World War I, we find thousands of American women who served as nurses and support staff, driving ambulances, serving as spies. They worked delivering mail. So thousands of women in these roles, and these are not, on the home front while the war is being fought in Europe. These are women who traveled to Europe. They were near the front lines or at the front lines. More than 400 of them were killed in action. And this is 1917, 1918, when we like to imagine that women were not allowed in combat, but somehow they're dying in combat. And this is just looking at American women. And again, this is women who are serving as women and not in combat roles. Again, we go back to the Civil War. We don't know how many, but potentially more than 1,000 are estimated to have fought in the Civil War disguised as men. Lax medical exams, and a lot of teenage boys were enlisting. So, teenage boy, 20-something-year-old woman, who knows? We're not really examining. All right, but moving on. So women are able, with the First World War, to leverage that service and those deaths. And I'll also mention that in the First World War, this is the first time that we do see women enlisting. So there are thousands of them who are working in the support roles that I mentioned, but 12,000 women enlisted in the Navy as non-commissioned officers. They were called Yeoman F. And this is due to a loophole, a little legal loophole that the Navy decided to take advantage of because they needed people. So the Naval Reserve Act of 1916 had conspicuously omitted mention of gender as a condition for service. So the Navy's like, all right, cool. Okay. All right. So women serve in World War I in pretty large numbers, all things considered. They don't have the right to even vote. And that had been directly used as a reason to continue to deny women the vote, was that women didn't serve. So we can see 1903, an editorial on women's suffrage looks at this question of should women be allowed to vote, and The author, Lyman Abbott, argues that granting women the vote without requiring military service of them would put them essentially in charge of making military and foreign policy decisions that men would be carrying out. So in 1918, when Woodrow Wilson finally calls for the passage of the 19th Amendment, he cites the service of women in World War I as being critical to that. He wrote that the services of women during this supreme crisis of the world's history have been of the most signal usefulness and distinction. The war could not have been fought without them, nor its sacrifices endured. And so he says, right, we have a responsibility now to give women the right to vote. Although, as Dr. Vonnahme mentioned earlier, ultimately this really in practice only gives the right to vote to a portion of American women. Native women don't get the right to vote. Black women in the South don't get the right to vote. But yeah, that is how we get then to the 19th Amendment. That also influences women gaining the right to vote in European countries as well. So we do see this uptick in women having the right to vote in countries. And then since that time, right, we have seen an expansion in women's service. Women's involvement in combat actually goes back farther, I think, and official legal involvement goes back even farther than people imagine to, I want to say 93, where we see women allowed in air combat for the first time. And so it's a lot of the women that we see initially leveraging that military service to run for office are doing it from the Air Force because they have combat service that they're able to talk about in their campaigns and to get themselves elected.
Right, and we just recently saw at the DNC a very high-profile female vet speaking at the DNC, the senator from Illinois, who not only was a combat vet but had a severe injury, and also was one of the few women to ever give birth in Congress as well. So
remarkable Senator Tammy Duckworth, whose commercials, if anybody remembers some of her earlier commercials, as she really makes a name for herself, they show her, you know, in her Army t-shirt, you know, learning to walk again as an amputee. They show her photos of her from her time deployed, where she was in combat, really making that case, hammering home the case that she served not just in the military, right, but that she served in combat, because that's one of the things that I think women who have served in the military often face are questions about the nature of their service. We don't see those questions as much about the service of men who are running for office. I think people tend to assume that male veterans have been deployed and have served in combat, even though many have not. And so, you know, you might have, for example, a JAG officer who might never have deployed to a combat area running for office, and you know, the commercials won't, of course, say that this person served in combat, but they might mention that the person served during certain conflicts, right? And the implication is combat service. And that implication sometimes goes unquestioned.
So one of the things that, you know, Dr. Best highlighted for us is a reminder that the 19th Amendment came as a direct result of women's involvement and direct service during World War I, but it also followed decades of organization and conflict to try to fight to expand women's rights, as suffrage being one of the key sort of representational moments for women. And so I thought it might be fun to end this really wonderful talk with a little bit of speculation. 100 years ago today, women, for the first time at the federal level, were able to cast a vote. And so I guess my question for the three of you is, what comes next? What's next for women's rights, and where do we see the role of women in politics in the next decade or even the next 100 years?
I guess I'll take a stab at it.
Great.
I think
it's a big question.
The biggest challenge at this point. So it's easier to unite around something like the right to vote than it is to unite around the idea of more representation, in part because of not just cross-cutting cleavages in the sense of race, ethnicity, religion, and so forth, but also in the sense of party, right? So you know, there's always been this argument from Republican women that their contribution to female representation is less valued because they are Republican women. And I think that's a question that I think we have to address sort of as a society, whether, you know, what we mean by representation is Democratic representation, or we mean female representation. And I think that's where we get the stalling, right? And so we get 25% of the Congress female, but do we get to 50%? It's not clear what that path looks like. And so I do think there's a lot of conversations that need to be had about what it means to be, you know, to represent, you know, women in this country as a legislator, and does that go across party lines or not? And if it doesn't, then are we restricted then in terms of how much representation we can have on the female side?
Yeah, and I do think, you know, we have a tendency to believe that time will inherently bring progress. You know, we think of the quote, "The arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice." And I think we have a tendency then to think, okay, we'll sit back and in, you know, 50 years, 100 years, we're going to have 50% women in government. And I question that. I do think, you know, that if we become sort of complacent and think, okay, well, you know, women have the right to vote, and we've had some women governors, and we've got women in Congress, and, you know, that that we're missing a lot that way. That we are missing. You know, we still have issues that are thought of as being women's issues, and those are often considered much less prestigious, for example. So we're thinking about things like policies that affect family or that affect health. Those are generally considered to be less prestigious policy areas or less important policy areas, even though we know that they do have a big impact on things like human security and even on economic development. So I would say don't assume that things are good and getting better. You know, they will not if we make those assumptions.
That's a perfect segue for me. I think more women in executive positions will lead to more policies that make the possibility of political careers, you know, will facilitate that possibility. So things like childcare and healthcare, and you know, it will probably most people have heard this has been remarked upon a lot in our latest worldwide crisis. If we, you know, took all the countries that have done the best job of controlling the pandemic, a significant, if I'm not sure, I haven't seen a count, but I would guess 60-70% of them are led by women executives. So hopefully with demonstration effects that get us more elected, more chief executive women, and then lead to policies that smooth the way a bit for women to enter politics. Maybe in 100 years, the whole world will be ruled by women.
I like your optimism.
I like it. So it sounds like that in 100 years, we've seen an incredible amount of change and success, but there's still a long way to go to achieving many of the goals that I think the suffragettes probably assumed would come with suffrage. And so it is not enough to achieve one goal, but view it as something that is constantly needing to be evaluated, not just here in the United States, but abroad. And that it's not just enough to have equal access to voting, if we don't have equal access to everything else. Still, I think we can say that 100 years later, we can thank all of those who fought for access to women's suffrage, and maybe end on the classic, well done, Sister Suffragette. And thank you all so much. One thing I'd like to point out is UMKC Political Science is unique in a lot of ways, but one of the ways that we are unique is we are one of the only departments, one of the very few departments in the United States that is a majority female faculty. And so even in academic circles, there's something we can always be striving for and learning learning to do more. But I want to thank all of my colleagues for being such wonderful representatives of women in political science. So thank you all so much. Real fast, if people want to learn more about the things that you've talked about, where can they go from your work or your teaching?
Take our classes.
Right.
Yeah.
Any specifics?
Well, I'll put in a plug for my Women in Conflict class, which should be offered in the spring as an Anchor 2 course.
Excellent.
Well, I'll plug some of my research then on weight bias in political candidates, which has a particular effect on women. And then Debra and I's work on far-right women, TBD, where you can find it if we ever have time to work with it. But the role of women in or the role of gender in determining whether or not people survive scandal.
Dr. Lyne, any of your classes you'd like to if people want to learn more about developing democracies and these aspects, where can they go?
Political Science 304, Politics of Developing Countries, and 220, Comparative Politics.
Great. And I'm teaching Women in Politics this semester, and have done my great work with Dr. Vonnahme, and we definitely talk a lot about descriptive representation in my Congress and Parliaments class, which you should see not this spring, but next. So I want to thank you all again for taking the time. Please let us know in the comments below if you have any questions for any of the faculty. And once again, take a moment to just celebrate 100 years of women's suffrage by getting your friends registered to vote. All right. Thank you, everyone.
Cheers to that, and thank you for organizing.
Yes, thanks, Debra, or Dr. Leiter.
All of the above.